Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to show you a demonstration of an all-grain brew day on what I call a CKB setup. That stands for Cooler Kettle Bucket. This is one of the simplest and cheapest ways to brew all grain, and it's a great option if you're moving from extract to all grain. You don't need a fancy system or a brew stand. This will make great beer, and you can easily expand it later on to something bigger and better. So this is a demonstration on how to use the CKB setup. So the equipment that I'm using is a 10-gallon Rubbermaid cooler. This is what I show you how to build in the do-it-yourself section. I'm using a 15-gallon Boilermaker kettle. Just make sure that your kettle is big enough to accommodate a full boil. I'm using a standard brewing bucket. This could be your bottling bucket. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. I'm using a propane burner or a turkey fryer. And finally, you need something to hold your mash tun and kettle to drain them. I'm using a fold-out table, but this could really be anything, a counter, a workbench, anything that will hold your vessels. Here is what I'm brewing. I'm making a Northern English brown. This comes from the Brewing Classic Styles book. I only changed around the hops and the yeast. Go ahead and pause the video if you want to take a longer look at this. Here are the key figures and assumptions for this brew day. Again, pause the video if you want to read through it. I'm going to mention them as we go along. And then there's also the worksheet that you can fill out for your own brew system, which includes these and more. The first thing I do is crush my grains, base grains and specialty grains, and I keep those in a bucket until I'm ready to add them to the mash. Then I measure out my strike water and put that into a separate bucket. Using my water to grain ratio of 1.75 quarts per pound, and knowing that I have 11.75 pounds of grain, this comes to 5.14 gallons. Then I pour the strike water into the kettle and I heat it up to 175 degrees. Now this part takes some explaining. Why am I heating it up to 175 when my assumptions say 159 for the strike water temperature? Well, that's because I'm going to pour the water into the cooler and the cooler will absorb a good amount of heat. So I'm going to wait until the water comes down to 159 and then add my grains. I'm essentially preheating the mash tun this way. Brewing software makes figuring out these numbers very simple. Check your water every few minutes. Once mine hits 175, it's ready to drain into the mash tun. If you have a smaller kettle, you might be able to pour your water into the cooler. Mine is bigger and I would give myself third-degree burns if I did that, so I'm going to use gravity and drain it into the cooler by lifting it up onto the table. Just be really careful in this step. Go ahead and drain all of the strike water into the mash tun. It takes about 10 minutes for the water to come down to 159, and then I'm ready to add the grains, or dough in. Then I dough in by adding some grains and stirring, then adding some more grains and stirring. I make sure to break up any dough balls. When I'm done stirring, I take the temperature of the mash, and it's right where I want it to be at 152. Then I put the top on and lift it onto the table to sit for 1 hour. It's a good idea to check the temperature every now and then. It's a really hot day in Denver, so I only lose 1 degree over the course of an hour. With about 20 minutes left in the mash, I start heating my sparge water. I know that I'll get 3.67 gallons from the mash, and my pre-boil target is 7.5 gallons, so that means that I need to add 3.83 gallons as sparge water. I heat this water to 190 degrees. After 1 hour of mashing, it's time for the boil-off. This is where I recirculate wort from the bottom of the mash tun back onto the top to filter out any grain particles that got through the bazooka screen. I do this about 4 times until the wort runs clear. Then I attach a piece of silicone tubing to the hose barb and drain the wort into the bucket. This is called the first runnings. Set this aside and try not to kick it over. Now it's time for the sparge. So I move the cooler to the ground next to the table and then put the kettle on the table. I hook up the tubing and drain the sparge water into the mash tun. Since I'm doing a single batch sparge, I drain all of the water into the mash tun. I try to get some of the grain that got stuck to the side of the cooler. Then I put the cooler back onto the table and stir in the sparge water. I let the mash tun sit for 5 minutes and in the meantime begin to heat the first runnings. This step saves some time. Then I do a boil-off just like I did with the first runnings. I recirculate until the wort runs clear. Then I drain the second runnings into the bucket. Once I drain all of my second runnings, I combine them with the first runnings in the brew kettle, and that brings me to my pre-boil volume. This is when you should take your pre-boil gravity reading. You'll need this number to figure out your efficiency from the mash. It's a good idea to stir the wort here to make sure that the first and second runnings are thoroughly mixed. I put a sample into a mason jar and cap it to cool down before taking a reading. It's also a good idea to note the pre-boil volume here in case it's different from what you expected. I hit my target pre-boil gravity of 1042 and volume of 7.5 gallons for an efficiency of 75%. I bring the wort to a boil and finish the brew day just like any other. I add the hops, cool the wort, and drain into the carboy before pitching the yeast. And that is an all-grain brew day on the CKB setup.